Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar on frequently asked questions on climate change adaptation in the biennial transparency reports. My name is Christian Ledwell, and I'm the knowledge manager for the NAP Global Network Secretariat at IISD. To get us started, just a few quick housekeeping points. Today's session is going to be 55 minutes long. Simultaneous translation into French and Spanish is available. Please feel free to introduce yourself and say hello by typing your name and affiliation into the chat box. And we are recording today's session in English, and we'll share the video and slides with the participants joining today as a follow-up after the event. Again, if you have any questions, comments, technical issues, don't hesitate to drop us a line in the chat box. Today's webinar is brought to you by the NAP Global Network, and in case this is your first time joining one of our events, the NAP Global Network was created in 2014 to support developing countries in advancing national adaptation planning processes and help accelerate adaptation efforts around the world. To achieve this, the NAP Global Network facilitates South-South peer learning and exchange. We support national level action on national adaptation plan processes, and we aim to generate, synthesize, and share knowledge on events like today's webinar. We have a really exciting panel of speakers today to share their experience on climate change adaptation. We'll be hearing from Emily Beauchamp, who is the lead on monitoring, evaluation, and learning for adaptation with the NAP Global Network Secretariat. We'll hear from Jeffrey Chi, who is a policy advisor with the NAP Global Network Secretariat. And we'll hear from Maria del Pilar Bueno, who is a senior researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research at the National University of Rosario in Argentina. So first off, we'll hear from Jeffrey Chi. We'll share the context on the basics of what you need to know about the adaptation chapter of the Biennial Transparency Report. Next, we'll hear from Emily Beauchamp, who is going to speak to the linkages between the BTR and several other adaptation-related reporting instruments to ensure coherence of information for adaptation and transparency reporting. And third, Pilar will explain how the new global goal on adaptation framework relates to the BTRs. We'll then have about 15 minutes for question and answers. And so please, again, do introduce yourself and share your comments and questions. So Jeffrey, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us to learn more about adaptation in the Biennial Transparency Report, and thank you to our interpreters for joining today's session as well. The Biennial Transparency Report, or the BTR for short, is an important transparency reporting instrument under the Paris Agreement, and as many of you might know, it is the first BTR is due at the end of the year on December 31st, 2024. And we've heard from a lot of countries that they're interested in submitting the adaptation chapter in the BTR. Hence, we thought we would provide more information on what it is, why it is so important, and how can countries prepare to develop the adaptation chapter in the BTR. So I think we should start with the background on what the BTR is and kind of how it came around. Back in 2015, the countries passed the Paris Agreement and established a new reporting and review mechanism called the Enhanced Transparency Framework, or the ETF. The ETF builds on previous experience and adapted to the Paris Agreement's universal membership to streamline reporting requirements and enhance transparency of action under the Paris Agreement. And the Biennial Transparency Report is the reporting instrument of the Enhanced Transparency Framework. It keeps flexibility in mind. So although all parties to the Paris Agreement are required to submit a biennial transparency report, it has a flexibility provision for small island developing states and least developed countries that they may submit at their discretion, noting the resource constraints and that transparency reporting is a very time and resource intensive process. So what are some of the purposes of the BTR? Well, for one, it demonstrates progress towards countries' respective commitments under the Paris Agreement and facilitate information sharing exchange on some of the lessons learned, experiences, and best practices, so countries themselves and also their peers can improve climate action. It helps countries to essentially demonstrate that they are sticking to the terms of the Paris Agreement and they are doing climate action at a domestic and subnational level. Secondly, the Biennial Transparency Report provides key information to the global stocktake process, which the first global stocktake concluded last year in Dubai. The global stocktake assesses the collective progress countries are making towards reaching the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. The BTR, the Biennial Transparency Report, is one of the sources of information for the global stocktake, along with adaptation communications, the national communications, as well as countries' other climate policies, including nationally determined contributions. And thirdly, the BTR process facilitates the development and the continuous improvement of a national monitoring, evaluation, and learning system for climate action, including mitigation, adaptation, information loss and damage, as well as the provision of means of implementation. So there are 5 different components to the Biennial Transparency Report. The first 2 are related to mitigation. These are the national inventory reports for greenhouse gas emissions, as well as progress made in implementing countries' nationally determined contributions. The first 2 are mandatory for both developed and developing countries, but small island developing states and least developed countries may submit BTRs at their discretion. And the last 2 parts of the BTR are related to means of implementation and support. These are financial technology transfer and capacity building support provided by developed country parties and by other parties that provide support. These are also means of implementation needed and received by developing country parties. But today we're mainly focusing on the third component of the BTR, which is climate change impacts and adaptation, as well as information related to loss and damage. Countries are not necessarily required to submit this chapter, but many countries we talk to are very interested and certainly will submit this chapter in their BTR if they're submitting a BTR this year. So I think we can delve a bit deeper into what are the elements and what are the different subchapters included in the adaptation chapter of the BTR. 2 decisions provided guidance on this matter. The first is Decision 18 CMA1, which establishes the modality, procedures, and guidelines for the entire Enhanced Transparency Framework. These are the MPGs that you will hear a lot when transparency experts talk about the Paris Agreement's transparency framework. In a subsequent decision, Decision 5 CMA3, parties established an outline for the Biennial Transparency Report, which included an outline for the adaptation and loss and damage chapter. So the first part of the adaptation chapter of the BTR mainly revolves around kind of background information related to national circumstances, your country's institutional arrangements and legal frameworks that's related to climate change, as well as the impact, risks, and vulnerabilities facing your country. So I think some of the guiding questions here are kind of what's the starting point of adaptation in your country, and what is the institutional arrangements, or what ministries, what departments, what teams are responsible for adaptation planning and implementation in your country. And of course, countries' adaptation plans are usually informed, or should be informed by an vulnerability risk assessment. So what are the present and future climate impacts facing your country? And how did your country conduct this climate vulnerability and risk assessment? I just want to note that in the next couple of slides, there are a lot of texts and with a lot of guiding questions, but the slide deck will be available after the webinar on the NAP Global Network website, so you could take a closer look. The second part of the ABTR really focuses on planning. What are the adaptation priorities and barriers, and what sort of strategies, plans, policy, and actions are your country planning or have planned to undertake to adapt to climate change? So some of the kind of the guiding question here are, what are the priority areas for adaptation in your country? And what barriers and challenges have you identified with regard to building resilience and adapting to climate change? And what adaptation actions have you planned, such as your National Adaptation Plan, NAPS, or other adaptation policy instruments? And how are they aligned with your country's overall national development priorities and other adaptation planning processes? The third component moves into the implementation part and the monitoring, evaluation, learning of adaptation. So what is the progress of implementation of adaptation in your country? What's your progress in terms of implementing your national adaptation plans and other adaptation policies? And how much international support has your country received? And how effective was those supports towards the implementation of your adaptation action? And monitoring, evaluation, and learning system for national adaptation is a crucial part, is a crucial component of your national adaptation plan. So how effective are the implemented measures, and what are the sustained impacts of your adaptation actions? How are they enhancing resilience and increasing adaptive capacity for the communities of your country? And most importantly, what are the capacities and capabilities of your national system for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, for adaptation? How did you establish the MEL framework, and what's the components of your MEL framework for adaptation? The fourth part moves into information related to loss and damage. These you can answer this chapter by answering kind of what losses and damages have been or are anticipated to be incurring in your country due to climate change, and what is your country's doing in terms of managing present and future losses and damages, including slow onset events. There are a couple guidances out there on how to assess and report on losses and damages, which my colleague Adrian will be sharing that resources in the chat. And many countries have already included information related to minimizing and addressing losses and damages in their national adaptation plans. We've published a report on this last year, and Adrian will also be sharing that report in the chats below. Now, lastly, before I hand it over back to Christian, the last section of the ABTR is the more forward-looking part, looking at what good practices, experiences, and lessons learned countries have gathered through your planning and implementation of adaptation actions, and how are they planning to share these information with other countries in order to enhance global progress of adaptation. And of course, there is a chapter where you can countries can include other information that they would like to include in the BTR with regards to adaptation, as well as losses and damages. And with this, I'm going to pass it over back to Christian.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. So next we'll hear from Emily on the links between BTRs and other adaptation-related instruments. Emily, over to you.
Thank you very much, Christian. And I'll be taking you through why is it important and some of the other details and questions that we usually have regarding adaptation BTR. So as Jeffrey mentioned, countries are not necessarily required to report on adaptation in the BTRs. We do recognize there are challenges linked and limitations in availability and access to data, availability of financial resources, time and resources constraint in drafting the BTR as well. But despite being optional, we really encourage countries to prepare an ABTR to first recognize countries' adaptation efforts, to provide necessary adaptation-related information for the GST, and especially for the assessment of the collective progress made towards the global goal on adaptation through the UAE framework for global climate resilience. It also really facilitates the sharing of experiences and best practices related to adaptation. It communicates adaptation-related needs in a very clear way. It reviews and strengthens the relevance and effectiveness of your national MEL system for adaptation. And it can also streamline the reporting requirements for adaptation. And I'll go into that a bit in the next slide. But I want to emphasize that we need to keep in mind that the second global stocktake starts in 2026 and will conclude in 2028. As such, there's two opportunities for countries to do an ABTR, once this year and one in 2026 in 2 years. So we can understand that the ones due in 2028 will be too late to be taken into account for the second GST. So we really encourage countries to think about doing an ABTR this year towards identifying gaps and then improving your reporting on adaptation in 2026. And this is all very critical information that needs to be available for the global stocktake too. Last, doing an ABTR also helps countries with other national reporting on sustainable development, and it can support other proposals for support, including international, bilateral, and national finance. Next. So one question we have a lot is about the relationship between BTRs and national communications. So the BTR does not replace a national communication. However, parties will have the option of combining the BTR and the national communication in years when the two reporting instruments overlap. And that is starting in 2026 for some parties and every 4 years thereafter. By submitting their BTRs and their national communications jointly, countries can streamline the reporting obligation under the UNFCCC and avoid duplication of efforts, as well as reducing burden on reporting in light of capacity constraints we've mentioned earlier. So also to recap, developing countries do have a timeline on national communications, whilst developing countries don't necessarily have a timeline. So for national communications, it's due in 2026 for the majority of countries. It is required for developed countries. And for developing countries, if they wish to align to this timeline, then it's also recommended again for streamlining the reporting burden. And BTRs are every 2 years. Next. So the way that countries can streamline their BTR and their adaptation communication. So BTR, just like they can streamline, national communication and BTRs, adaptation communication can also be streamlined through ABTR. ABTR can be a vehicle for an outcome. So countries may submit an outcome as a component of another communication. So ABTR can play a big role in countries' outcomes, and it can help, again, reduce reporting burdens and streamline reporting obligations. Next slide. So this table here shows the alignment between BTRs, NAP, outcomes, and other national reports, such as progress reports on the NAP process, but it can also serve for other national reports, for example, national development strategies. So, for example, countries can decide to submit their BTRs jointly as a national communication. They can also choose to report jointly their BTRs with an outcome, and they can really leverage their NAPs in informing their ABTR. A quick reminder that the outcome is a report prepared by countries that can synthesize and share their priorities, their needs, their efforts, and lessons around climate change. And it can be submitted by itself or as a component in conjunction with other communications documents. The one thing that is good to flag in the BTR, and that is quite different from the NAP or the outcome, is the section E and F on the effectiveness and the monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems of the country. So the BTR as a reporting instrument can really help take stock of the progress and communicate that progress, going beyond identifying the needs and the actions. So in short, parties may choose their own schedule for submitting an outcome, and communicating it with a BTR can be very, very synergetic. We'll just flag that the NAP Global Network has also produced frequently asked questions on outcomes and how a report on how to leverage NAP process to prepare outcomes, which my colleague Christian or Adrian will share just now. Next slide. The other thing that is really that we really encourage parties to do an ABTR, and again in line with sharing the reporting, creating this habit of reporting and of learning, is because there's a voluntary review process for ABTRs. So as per the Paris Agreement, most chapters of the BTRs will be reviewed through a technical expert review process, except for the adaptation chapters. So this is optional. But countries have highlighted the important role that ABTR reviews could play in facilitating and sharing experiences and gradual improvements in adaptation reporting. So there was a decision in 2022 that allows countries to request the UNFCCC Secretariat to organize a voluntary review of the adaptation section of the BTR. And the review will include whether the ABTR is prepared in accordance with the MPGs. And also it will help countries identify areas of improvement and capacity building related to adaptation reporting in consultation with the parties. So this is really a great opportunity for countries to work through and get some support in identifying how to better report on adaptation nationally and globally. Next. I will now pass on to Pilar to share some of her experience on ABTR. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, and hi, everybody. Thank you for this invitation to share with all of you with respect to the global goal on adaptation in particular. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The global goal on adaptation, as you may recall, was included already in the Paris Agreement after a lot of negotiation on this regard in 2015. The main components of the Global Goal on Adaptation, or the GGA, are enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability, with two main contextual components that are sustainable development and the temperature goal. Even though the timeline is bigger, here I just tried to reflect some of the milestones. Of course, there are many more, but for you to record that there is a very interesting technical paper on the Adaptation Committee some years after, and that really was helpful in order to understand which were the main challenges in order to assess progress, because we not only have Article 7.1, but we also have 7.14d, that is where the review of the progress made in achieving the GGA should take place, and that is the global goal, the global stock take. So these are the main features, and that is also related to the framework, as I will refer in a minute. So in Glasgow, we have the launch of and starting the launch of the framework. Why a framework? Because we all understood together as an adaptation community that it was very important to have a technical and political tool in order to do this, or to work with these two functions that are currently in the purpose of the framework, to achieve the GGA and really to review the progress. So in order to do that, even if the 7.1 components are very clear, the different organizations, parties, people that are part of the adaptation community understood that we need this political and methodological framework to understand, to accomplish, to fulfill, to really implement better and to understand better. So last year in Dubai, we could have the opportunity to adopt this framework. Now the name is the Framework for Global Climate Resilience. Next one, please. And in this next slide, you will see some of the components that probably you already know, but I'm very happy to chat more on this. This framework is comprehensive in terms of different components negotiated during the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program of 2 years between Glasgow and to Dubai. And this framework includes this purpose I already mentioned, these two functions that are really trying to enhance both adaptation and support, as well as some principles and cross-cutting considerations. And something that I think it's very important to take into account are the targets, sectoral targets, as well as dimensional targets related to the different moments of the iterative adaptation cycle. We also have, and now I will focus on the ABTRs in particular, saying that all this framework is built on the basis on using same sources of information, so current communication and reporting system on adaptation, as well as all the provisions in terms of means of implementation and process ahead from last COP, so from Dubai to Brazil, in order to have this two-year work program on indicators. So let me please move to the next one. In order, the main issues related to the GGA in the MPGs and how that is directly related to what countries will really submit this year and on the global goal. So as you may see, and Jeffrey referred to this, there is one specific part in the MPGs that refer to the global goal on adaptation, that is para 109 and under point D, where we have adaptation strategies, policies, plans, goals, etc. So different to the other adaptation-related documents that Emily mentioned. So we have many adaptation-related documents, national communications, adaptation communications, NDCs, NAPs, etc. So if we see the guidance and guidelines of these different instruments, the only one currently at least referring to the global goal on adaptation specifically is the BTR. So that's something, that's a good news for this year to consider that we will have the opportunity for all the BTRs and the adaptation section of the BTRs. We have this invitation for parties to consider the inclusion of this intersection between actions, national actions and the global goal. So here where I wanted to reflect is that which are some of the main challenges and opportunities. So in terms of the how, because if you see the framework of last year, you will understand that the CMA also requests the different bodies of the UNFCCC, the Adaptation Committee, the LEG, the CGE, to develop specific or to conduct specific work, understanding that there are some gaps in current guidance and guidelines or of the other adaptation-related documents. That's clear. But at the same time, we have the opportunity to include in this one, this year, the information that the countries already have with respect to the different components of the framework. So some opportunities there are related to the main three issues, the main three components. So in the narrative, countries could consider adaptive capacity, resilience, vulnerability, how they are reducing vulnerability on that regard, and to have a narrative related to these three main components that are finally the most important parts of the GGA. Then, of course, now we have in the framework this set of dimensional and sectoral targets. So countries can consider how, according to their own actions, since they are reporting adaptation action, how their current actions are related to the different moments of the adaptation policy cycle, the assessment, the planning, implementation, and monitoring, evaluation, and learning, as well as with the 7 dimension sectors related to the targets. Of course, the cross-cutting considerations are also very important. Countries also have the opportunity to refer to gender responsive measures, to indigenous local knowledge, traditional knowledge, different approaches. So there are many ways that not only in the narratives, but also with respect to process, which specific process are developing the countries in order to achieve expected outcomes and impacts related to reducing the vulnerability, increasing resilience and adaptive capacity. And of course, with respect to MOIs, means of implementation, and that is finance technology and capacity building, countries also have the opportunity, in particular developing countries, to submit information related to what they need and also what they received, as well as developed countries to provide information in terms of provided. So it's also very good opportunity for countries in terms of MOIs and consider the NCQG negotiations for this year to make this linkage and be very specific on how the different dimensions, the multi-level nature of adaptation is related. So that narrative and that information is critical to receive. So why? That is part of what I am saying. So to inform the next GST, because we need to be better, in terms of process and in terms of outcomes, so we can really help the next process with better information, specific information using the framework. Also to contribute to a general process of learning and understanding together which are the main needs, which are the actions that the countries are already developing in relation to the framework, to the targets in particular, and cross-cutting consideration, to inform the two-year work program on indicators, because for 2 years, the parties and the adaptation committee will be discussing indicators, so the information, including in ABTRs, will be very important to inform that process, to understand better what the countries are really saying, reporting that they are doing, and how that is related to the framework, their own interpretation, as well as NCQG discussion this year. And two main issues, of course, with respect to the contribution to the review of the guidance and guidelines of the other adaptation-related documents that will happen in the next years, and that is recognized in the decision of Dubai, as well as, of course, the most important, that is finally that adaptation happens, because that's the most important, that adaptation happens, that it make more visible, that we can have more action and more support oriented to adaptation. So yeah, these are some of my reflections. Thank you very much, and happy to answer your questions and to receive your comments.
Thank you so much, Pilar. That was really, really interesting and helpful presentation. To our colleague in the chat from Sierra Leone, please do rest assured that we will be sharing a recording of the event as well as all of the presentation slides in a follow-up after the webinar. So we would now like to open it up to a question and answer period for the next 15 minutes or so. And so please feel free to share your questions in English, French, or Spanish. For the first question, we have one from a colleague in Democratic Republic of Congo, and I'll ask Emily to take this one. So Emily, how are countries going to finance the implementation of the adaptation priorities in their BTRs? And how much of this finance will come from countries with high greenhouse gas emissions? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. And it's a very good question. It's a very salient question. So we know that in general with the UNFCCC and global pledges, so for example, in Copenhagen COP15 in 2009, developed countries committed to a collective goal of mobilizing $100 billion per year by 2020 for climate action in developing countries. But we also know from global reports like the IPCC's sixth assessment report and the yearly adaptation gap reports that this level of finance is not being met. I'm also going to link with the current negotiations that Pilar mentioned about the new collective quantified goal on finance, that some of these goals are being renegotiated this year. So my response to you is, for the moment, I don't know, but the ABTR is very much supposed to, as Pilar said, make adaptation and loss and damage more visible. So communicating what are your needs and specifically on what actions and providing this evidence for gaps of where finance is most needed on adaptation in your countries, what actions you want to get financed, especially in light of if you can provide what is working, what has been working and what has not been working, right? So like in terms of the effectiveness of adaptation action in your country, this will be extremely important and helpful and necessary in order to inform the NCQG, but also to inform other pledges by country and to inform, for example, your proposals for other international finance, for bilateral finance, and for national finance when there is the possibility. And Jeffrey, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is in section H and I of the ABTR, where countries are invited to report on implementation and support needs of developing countries, on the support provided, including on adaptation in the countries, and how support meets the adaptation needs. So it is a very big opportunity to highlight whether or not finance has been meeting your adaptation needs, and if so, what is needed. So really reiterating again, this is an opportunity to communicate what are your needs and you know, on what. So I hope this helps.
Thanks so much, Emily. The next question is from Tampa in Sierra Leone. And I'll direct this, perhaps, Emily, to you first, and Pilar, it would be great to hear your thoughts on this as well. Are there specific tools to conduct climate change vulnerability assessments?
Yes, there are. There is, I mean, the first guidelines that come to mind that are quite important and that are embedded in the UNFCCC process would be the LEG, so the least developed countries expert group guidelines on formulating and implementing the NAP process. And there is some information on how to do climate risk assessments and some of the key considerations for CRAs, climate risk assessments in your country. I will add that there is actually quite a diversity of climate risk assessment methodologies that are available in the field out there. And we can also share some of the examples from the NAP Global Network on how countries have developed and implemented climate risk assessments in their countries. But I will emphasize the need to to use climate risk assessments to really understand your vulnerabilities and where the priority areas are in your country in order to plan your adaptation actions, implement them, but also to track and assess them and how they are, how effective they are. So we can share a few links on how to start looking into climate risk assessment and how to contextualize it to your context.
Thanks so much.
And I think Pilar can talk about her country experience on implementing this.
Indeed. So Pilar, any advice that you'd have for a colleague in Sierra Leone on approaches to climate risk assessments?
Just to say that I agree with what Emily said. There are many tools in the UNFCCC in general with the bodies developed so far with different organizations. And in particular, not only manuals and guidance that are very important, and I recognize also recent work of the CGE also related to the ABTR, so that can be helpful in order to understand that interface that is not only with respect to the national process, but also how that is linked to the global and reporting process. At the same time, the spirit of this stage of the iterative adaptation cycle or the adaptation policy cycle in the GGA is not only related to a very good assessment, iterative good assessment, but also to understand how that really helped, of course, in terms of the NAP process, planning, implementation, and MELD processes. So that's the main spirit of the targets. To understand that is not something close or in silo. You can have very good tools and very good assessment, but if that is not very well related to your adaptation priorities, what you are planning to do, how you report it, etc., so then your assessment will not be so useful in terms of what we are all looking for with respect to reducing vulnerability, adaptive capacity, and resilience. So that comment from my part too. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And so for the next question, Jeffrey, can you please tell us what are the considerations when submitting a BTR together with a national communication? What are the considerations for adaptation? Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I think, as mentioned kind of by Emily in that table, that countries have the opportunity to submit BTR and national communications separately every 4 years, or they have the opportunity to present a joint BTR NC in the year when NC is submitted. So in the year where BTR NC aligns, so usually every 4 years after 2026, and if the party wants to kind of submit an adaptation BTR, the adaptation chapter of the BTR, they basically satisfied the requirements for national communications reporting on adaptation. But there's one element that the BTR guidance is missing in comparison to the national communication reporting. That is the supplemental chapter on research and systematic observations. And education training and public awareness following 2 guidances. So that they're Decision 6 CP25 and Decision 17 CP8. Both of these are in the FAQ document. that Adrian has shared at the beginning of the webinar. But all that to say is if countries want to kind of present a joint BTR-NC and that they're going to include the adaptation chapter, then they should probably add additional information on kind of what are their national research and systematic observation capabilities and plans, and what are some of the education and training and public awareness opportunities or activities that they're conducting in terms of adaptation. Hope that helps.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. And a follow-up question. We have a comment from our colleague, Cristina Rodriguez from the government of Peru, who notes that the Peruvian government is aiming to prepare the fourth national communication for July 2024, with the BTR planned for the end of the year. What would you recommend in terms of alignment and efforts to not duplicate on adaptation? Thanks.
I think because so thank you so much for that question. I think it's a concern for many countries that are submitting national communications this year. As Emily has mentioned and also in our FAQ documents, there are a lot of alignments between information of an NC and of the BTR. So it's also important to note that the BTR outline for the adaptation chapter is optional per se. Don't like to use that word. I know it's not technically correct, but it is a guidance. Parties do not necessarily have to follow it to the letter of the T. So if a country is submitting an NC this year, they could always reference their national communication in their BTR. This year. So in their BTR adaptation chapter for 2024, they can always just say that we already provided this information in the national communications, or they may choose to copy and paste the same information from their national communication. So it's all that to say is that the guideline is, there's flexibility in the guidelines, and it's really up to countries to how to streamline your reporting and streamline your information gathering as well.
Excellent. Thanks so much. We have a further question from Don from St. Lucia in the chat, and Jeffrey, I think that this is one for you as well, but Emily Pilar, please do come in. In terms of guidance on loss and damage information in the BTR, what would you recommend for colleagues looking for structure for guidance on that point?
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of loss and damage, the outline doesn't necessarily provide a mandatory outline for countries to use. But in general, I think a lot of countries might wish to provide three pieces of information. So kind of one is what are the observed and potential climate change impacts, including those related to extreme weather events and slow onset events. So these are the two that's specifically mentioned in the context of averting, minimizing, and addressing losses and damages associated with climate change impacts. And the second element that I think countries might wish to report on is kind of activities related to averting, minimizing, and addressing losses and damages. These could be early warning systems, managed retreats, or any other activities that are relevant for slow onset events and also extreme weather events. And I think many countries are already experiencing or have already experienced losses and damages associated with climate change impacts. So it's also important to kind of raise the awareness and also kind of report on what has already happened and what are the support needs. Again, raising the kind of profile on the support needed in terms of confronting the climate crisis. And lastly, similar to the adaptation chapter, it might always be useful to include a section on institutional arrangements in terms of facilitating the implementations of activities related to loss and damage. These are departments that might be different from your climate change, the ministries or departments responsible for climate change adaptation. These could be Ministry of Public Safety or other departments that are dealing with emergency management. So it's always good to report on that information as well. But I pass it over to Emily.
Yes, so as Jeffrey mentioned, like very important to state what is there and what you're doing and what is happening. And if you want to go beyond, a few countries are also including evaluation of needs related to loss and damage. These mostly include valuations of economic damages. For example, projected losses to one that is often considered is damages linked to biodiversity, linked to the loss of, for example, income in tourism areas that are disturbed by losses and damage. We can think of, for example, coastal regions that rely a lot on tourism, so loss of livelihoods, and also loss of human lives. So that is all more quantified information that you can add. But my colleague Agrian has shared a good reference from the UNU that also shares that you can use also expert interviews to inform data on what dating and how to combine to collect information on what loss and damage impacts will be. You can also include more qualitative stories of change about loss and damage, and that can also be very powerful as part of your ABTR. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emily. So another question we've received from multiple colleagues, Pilar, it would be great to get your advice on what should countries do if they have already submitted an adaptation communication in recent years? And do they need to now submit a biennial transparency report? What advice would you give?
Thank you, Christian. And just to make a very, very quick comment with respect to loss and damage, agreeing with Jeffrey and Emily and saying that maybe a political consideration from my part to say that many times when you see adaptation and loss and damage together in a chapter, that is, of course, not science at all, but and it's not even a reflect of what is happening at the national level. It's more a reflect of negotiations. So it's more, do you have it together or you don't have it? So please remember when you prepare your BTRs that this is a very good opportunity to show the differences, the real differences between, but also the intersections between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And Jeffrey talked about also the importance of having means of implementation related, that is also recognized in operationalizing recent fund and funding arrangements. So I think using MPGs, we can also use them wisely in order to give the narrative that the country in particular would like to provide with respect to what is happening at home, with respect to adaptation and loss and damage separately, and their relationship. And with respect to this recent question by Christian and the colleagues, thank you for, I think that all the time we are dealing with the overlaps between the adaptation related documents. So, and Emily referred to this a lot in her presentation. And as developing countries and even technicians related to those processes, I think that we, for some decades, saw the opportunity of making adaptation more visible. So not to see the ABTR as an additional burden, but also part of the cycle. If you are developing an adaptation process at home, if you have an app, if you iterate in that process, then to use the adaptation-related documents, considering the timelines of the UNFCCC, in order to provide that information, make it more visible with respect to different moments. 2024 is a very good moment in order to show the reporting of what you did, even to report on what you couldn't achieve, considering, for example, the lack of resources, but also what you did with your own resources, all your achievements and the process you are already. And adaptation communications can be, if you already submit an adaptation communication, you maybe already know that you may pledge there, but you can also report, because outcomes are a bridge between all the documents. So for many developing countries, adaptation communications were part of NDCs, part of that pledges, but of course for some countries, they will be part of adaptation component of BTR. So My suggestion is to consider your own narrative at the national level, your own narrative, your own story, where you are. If you recently submit an adaptation communication and it's more pledge oriented, so this is a good opportunity to develop an ABTR that is more reporting oriented. So that's depending on your own moment, and take it as an opportunity.
Thanks so much, Pilar. We'll take one last question from the audience, and then I'll ask all panelists to share one final message or reflection. And so from a colleague from Lebanon, Emily, we have the note that it's noted that there's an opportunity to report adaptation through the BTR, but what about the time resources and reporting burden related, as many parties tend to prioritize greenhouse gas emission inventories, tracking the NDC, and financial support received. So what advice would you give to teams that are very capacity constrained, where do they fit this into their work plans?
Thank you, Leah. And also a very tough question, but a very, very relevant. I'll be honest and I'll say, do your best. I think this is really an opportunity to highlight, what you need as part of the ABTR. And as Pilar just mentioned, what is your narrative? I think that simply the fact of reporting, we really wanted to report on adaptation in this BTR, but we do not have the capacity. And to bring as much information as you have accessible in, a time-efficient manner into that section is better than nothing. So start small, and then look for improving at the next window. And bearing in mind that the ABTR is for reporting on the UNFCCC, but folks, countries need to really also view it as a national exercise that's going to be useful for improving their national monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems for adaptation, and in general for creating this habit and requesting the resources, pointing out the fact that there is not enough capacity and resources for you to fulfill this report. So do the best you can, and something is better than nothing.
Thanks so much, Emily. So with that, I think that's the final audience question we can take, but I will just ask for one last reflection, one last message that you would like the colleagues who have joined us here today to take away on adaptation in the biennial transparency reports. Pilar, if I can pass to you first, what would you share as kind of one takeaway message from this discussion?
Yes, thank you. Probably is that maybe different countries and representatives here of countries, as some mentioned and everything during the chat and the QA, there are a lot of gaps and challenges with respect to the overlap, with respect to preparing BTRs and not having enough time or resources. So sometimes can be considered that include GGA or global goal adaptation considerations is an additional burden, even considering the ABTR a burden. So my message is that is not the case. Please try to take it, as we said, as an opportunity, because you are helping to shape conversations from here to the future in terms of the indicators. You are also helping to shape all the conversations on adaptation in the NCQG. You also can help to shape all the conversations in Brazil and FGST. So there are many opportunities, also not only an issue of burden. So my recommendation is to really, as Emily said, to please go ahead and try to submit information, even from your interpretation on the targets and the cross-cutting considerations, even without a specific guideline or guidance. And of course, we are all happy to help if you have specific questions on how to shape that better, how to fit that better in your document. So thank you.
Thank you, Pilar. Jeffrey, can I pass to you next, please?
Sure. Yeah, agree with everything that Pilar has said. And just to add that, I think from the experience of the last global stocktake that's taken place for the last 2 years, there is real asymmetry of information between information on mitigation and means of implementation versus information on adaptation. We didn't really have a lot of information to work with to kind of provide this global assessment and to provide the forward-looking information, things like best practices, things like experiences and lessons learned on adaptation. So the BTR is an important source of information for the next global stocktake, as Emily has mentioned, and is super crucial for all countries to really submit and to be able to kind of provide information for this global assessment, so that the decision can capture the reality a bit better hopefully for the next round, and also to inform future climate actions. And as Pilar and Emily has mentioned already, there are so many different places where you can already find existing information to put into your BTR, especially the adaptation chapter, from your NAP, from the NAP progress report, from different outcomes, from different country, your national policies. So a lot of information is already out there, and especially on loss and damage, as I mentioned. Lots of countries are communicating information on their losses and damages in their national adaptation plan. So information are already out there, and it's about kind of streamlining the reporting to make sure that this is not an additional burden, but also smart reporting to outline your political priorities in the UNCCC process, but also in your domestic adaptation and climate priorities. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And Emily, the last word is yours. One takeaway message from this discussion.
One takeaway message. I'll reiterate what my colleagues have said. It's about having a first go at doing reporting on adaptation. It does not have to be perfect. There is no country that has a perfect reporting on adaptation, and there is no perfect monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems on adaptation in sustainable development in general. So it's about sharing your country's story, sharing your narrative, and building from that. And it has to be seen as a first step, as a building block. So I would really encourage you to, again, do the best you can, leverage some of the support that is available for the voluntary review, ask for information to our international organizations such as NABDN and other organizations. We've shared links in the chat, and share what you can. And already this is going to be a tremendously helpful in shaping global, but also your national narratives to improve adaptation action. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Emily. With that, we'll close the webinar. Big thanks again to our panelists and to all of you for joining us today. As mentioned, we will share the recording and the presentations, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. If you have any questions, yes.
I was going to say, is it also possible to share all the links that we've shared? Because we've shared a lot of links in the chat.
Certainly.
There's a question.
So no problem to share those in a follow-up email to all registered. And hopefully some of those links will answer some of the questions. But if we weren't able to cover any, please feel free to contact us at the email address for the NAP Global Network shown on this slide. Please also feel free to follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter for the latest news, analysis, and resources on national adaptation planning processes. With that, we'll close, but just a huge thank you again, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you.